Good afternoon and welcome to a Novara Media, the world transformed crossover at this virtual fringe. I'm Michael Walker. Today we are going to be discussing, I suppose, the big questions which surround this virtual Labour Party conference. What did Starmer's first 6 months as leader of the Labour Party tell us about what he actually wants, how he wants to govern the party, not how he won the leadership election? And after 5 years of controlling the party, are the Labour left in a position to influence the new leader at all? Or in terms of the party, at least, are they in the wilderness now? To answer that question, I have a stellar set of guests. First of all, I have Dawn Butler. Dawn Butler is MP for Brent Central. Dawn served as a minister under Gordon Brown, and after nominating Corbyn in 2015 to broaden the debate, went on to be one of the most valued players in his shadow cabinet. She is now one of Labour's most high-profile backbenchers. Dawn, it is a pleasure to have you back on Novara Media.
Hey, Michael. It's great to be back. Love it.
Are you a regular at TWT as well?
I've done a fair bit. Probably not as much as they want me to. So apologies.
I also have with me James Schneider. James Schneider was a founder of Momentum before going on to become Director of Strategic Communications for Jeremy Corbyn. In the warts and all accounts that have come out since Corbyn stood down as leader, James comes out relatively unscathed, which I think is owing to a general recognition that whilst many people in the Corbyn project fell through no fault of their own into roles they might have been ill-suited for, he was genuinely good at both communications and strategy. Welcome to the show, James.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. I think that's a bit too kind, but thanks anyway.
And finally, I'm joined by Patrick Maguire, who is a political reporter at The Times. Patrick is now a Westminster insider and spent most of the Corbyn years at The New Statesman. He is the co-author of the recent Left Out, an inside story of the Labour Party since 2017. It's a gripping read, though if you are invested in the rows that raged at the top of the Labour Party over the last 3 years, it's not very relaxing, I will warn you. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, Patrick.
Thank you for having me. Don't hold that against me.
It wasn't, you didn't advertise it as a relaxing read, so that's fine. We are going to start with a video because I am going to, actually, first of all, I'll say I'm going to sort of divide this conversation into two parts. So the first half of the show is going to be who is Keir Starmer, what does he want? And the second half is going to be how can the Labour left influence him, or have influence within the Labour Party by whichever means we are talking about. So to kick off the who is Keir Starmer, I want to remind us how he, the pitch he made when he won his position as Labour leader. This is his first campaign vid, which made waves when he first announced his bid to be leader of the party.
In the struggles of the 1980s, the Labour movement stood together in solidarity against Thatcher. Keir defended the print workers at Wapping. He was in the crowd that night when police on horseback charged into the peaceful picket. He was there for the dockers in Dover in the P&O dispute, helping the families of strikers who had had their benefits cut off by the Tory government. He gave free legal advice to the poll tax protesters in Trafalgar Square. And in 1992, we stood up for my union, the National Union of Mine Workers. When the Tories closed the mines, we took them to court for failing to provide a just transition for workers. Keir stood in solidarity with workers and trade unions.
Keir stood up for the protesters who were trying to stop the widening of the M3 and the destruction of the downland, when the full force of the state was against them. When Shell tried to sink the Brent Spar oil platform into the North Sea, Keir challenged this with Greenpeace to prevent an environmental catastrophe. For 10 years, he defended Helen Steele and David Morris when they were sued for libel by McDonald. They fought all the way and won. And Keir defended me and many others to bring public scrutiny and awareness to the presence of the United States visiting forces so that we can live in a more peaceful and less secretive society. Keir never asked for anything in return, never sought to take the credit or make a name for himself.
In 2003, he published a legal opinion in The Guardian that the invasion of Iraq would be unlawful and marched with millions against the war. Keir took the last Labour government to court over its decision to deny welfare benefits to asylum seekers. I don't think anyone really expected someone who dedicated his career to defending workers, trade unions and activists to become Director of Public Prosecutions. Keir never forgot where he came from. As DPP, he stood up to the powerful. He had the courage to prosecute MPs for cheating on their expenses and to take on the Murdoch press for phone hacking. He prioritised changing prosecution guidelines on violence against women and girls, and he was instrumental in getting justice for Stephen. I was delighted when I saw Keir become a Labour MP in 2015 and so proud of the way he battled alongside Jeremy Corbyn against Tory Brexit and the Tories' plans to sell off the NHS.
I've spent my life fighting for justice, standing up for the powerless and against the powerful. I still believe another future is possible where we can open up power and opportunity to all of our communities. We can confront the climate crisis with a Green New Deal. We can promote peace and justice around the world with a human rights-based foreign policy. We can rebuild our economic model in place of the failed free market one. We can renew our democracy and spread power across all of our communities and halt the rise of racism and division across our country. Another future is possible for our party as well. We can put factionalism and division on one side and unify around a radical programme where we can draw on the talents and strengths of all our members and supporters across the movement. Our party must move forward. There can't be any going back. Another future's possible, but we've got to fight for it. Together, we can and we will win.
So I watched that again for the first, well, not for the first time, revisited it this morning. It still almost brings a tear to one's eye. You can see how the guy won the Labour leadership. That, along with his association with Remain, was the appeal, really. He was saying, well, unite the party. I'll bring forward the same activist spirit, really, that Jeremy Corbyn had, but whilst being competent and professional. Now he's won the leadership. Some people have seen or I think the message has changed, let's put it like that. So far from putting forward a radical agenda when it comes to the economy, Starmer has not really taken a position on anything as yet. In terms of social movement, Starmer has been weak on Black Lives Matter and condemned direct action aimed at the Murdoch press. And well, I suppose you could see this as contrary to the commitment to unite the Labour Party. He has sacked two high-profile socialist campaign group members from his front bench, so Rebecca Long-Bailey from the Shadow Cabinet and Lloyd Russell-Moyle, who was a junior Shadow Minister. Patrick, I'm going to start with you. I've obviously presented sort of a particular narrative there, which is that Keir Starmer presented himself as left-wing, and then when he became leader, turned out to be a wolf in sheep's clothing, and his greatest achievement was, I suppose, to trick the left into thinking he was something that he was not. Am I being fair?
I don't think you're necessarily being unfair. I mean, look, there are two crucial things to analyse here. One is Starmer himself, and that video does give a sort of fairly comprehensive overview of his career and his politics, which those who know him in the 80s do say was sort of, firmly to the left of the Labour mainstream. European red-green is how a lot of people put it, and I think in his heart, Keir Starmer undoubtedly still has those politics. But the crucial omission in that video, if you look at his biography, and by his own admission, this was a crucial episode. You have there, the years of activist advocacy, and then he's DPP, and then he's Labour MP. The crucial episode Keir Starmer says in developing his thinking, and this actually sheds some light on, the sort of moral underpinning of this competency critique, is he spent 5 years after the Good Friday Agreement as the human rights advisor to the Northern Ireland Policing Board. And obviously the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the sort of, the occupying force of the Troubles, as many nationalists saw it, was being reformed, turning the police service in Northern Ireland. And Keir Starmer was responsible for, essentially telling this institution what it could and couldn't do and what it was getting wrong in terms of human rights. And I interviewed Keir during the leadership campaign in March, and he said that was a crucial point because he'd always been anti-police. He'd spent years and years pursuing individual cases against the police, and he got inside the PSNI And then he said he found that actually things that would take years, doing sort of pro bono legal representation for victims of police violence or whatever, he could do immediately. If only the police could better exercise the power they had. And so that's sort of, if you tie that into what's happening now, the government would be doing a better job if only it was, if only it could do better. You're not questioning the underlying ethics or morality of policing in this case, or you're not questioning necessarily the morality or ethics of the decisions the government is making. It's, if you did it better, it would be the net impact on the public would be less painful. So that's one crucial element. And the second element, as you said, did Keir Starmer convince people he was the candidate of, say, ideological and political continuity, and now he's representing a huge breach with the Corbyn years? I'd say the crucial thing is, regardless of what Starmer thinks about anything, look at the people who are around him. People like Morgan McSweeney, David Evans. These are not people of the Labour left. These are not people whose careers in Labour politics have been spent trying to platform left-wing voices in the Labour Party. Indeed, in the case of Evans and McSweeney, their whole mission, be it under Blair and be it during the sort of the years between the first leadership election and the 2020 leadership election, were thinking about how you marginalise the left. And it's true to say, Morgan McSweeney's big thing is thinking about expressing things in terms of values and creating spaces where people who wouldn't necessarily agree on ideology can agree on sort of big picture issues, and that, in a way, the whole point of the campaign, as people like that saw it, was to marginalise organised Corbynism, or to, dislocate the membership that was so supportive of Corbyn over the course of 2015 to 2020 from the sort of institutional moorings that sustain the left in power, without necessarily telling them that's what they were doing. And I think on that count, they've been very successful.
I want to go to James, because you were, I suppose, an insider working with Starmer for a while, for a long time, when you were in Lotto and he was Brexit secretary, or shadow Brexit secretary, sorry. But then you went on to be sort of drafted in to Rebecca Long-Bailey's campaign. What do you make of his leadership compared to the Starmer you knew when he was in the shadow cabinet? Do you think that he has sort of visually changed from the outside? Do you think he did sort of make himself out to be more left-wing than he actually was, and that we're seeing a different Starmer now that he's become leader of the party? James, you need to unmute your microphone. Maybe I'm going to go to Dawn while you work out how to unmute that.
Here we go. Done.
We've got it. We've got it. Great. You heard my question, so
Sorry,
you can now answer it.
So I think he's leading in quite a similar way to how he was Brexit secretary, which is totally different to also shadow Brexit secretary, which is really rather different to that campaign video. I mean, I obviously supported Rebecca Long-Bailey as the left candidate, and I'd gone on holiday in early January, and I came back and I'd had my phone off for a week, and that was lovely. But then I turned it on, and basically the first thing I saw was this video, and it genuinely gave me nightmares, because it's so good. And you watch that and you think, right, his appeal to the party membership is absolutely pitch perfect, and true enough it was. But I think we haven't heard any of that stuff. I mean, I was just noting it down there, what made up the radical program in his video. Rebuild the economic model. We've had absolutely none of that. They've run away from talking about wealth taxes or anything else. Green New Deal, there's none of that. Racism, well, you've mentioned the failings over Black Lives Matter. Redistributing power and democratic reform, we have not had a peep out of that. And then human rights foreign policy, there hasn't been any. And so I think that what he has been effective at is the management of the media has been very effective, and hats off to him for that. And they are pursuing a coherent strategy, and they are sticking to it. But I don't think we should be under any illusion that strategy is a socialist strategy, and it was never going to be a socialist strategy. It is a strategy for progressive social reforms. It's a strategy to have nicer people running the government in the hope that they will run it better than the current lot, and of course they would do. But it's not a strategy for social transformation. It's not a strategy to confront the climate crisis. It's not a strategy to transform the economy. But on its own terms, it's working quite well, and I think we should be clear exactly what it is, and not not criticize it for not being what it was never going to be. Keir was never going to be the candidate that he presented himself as, which is basically, look, you can have 80% of Corbynism, all the stuff you like, 80% of it, but it's just going to be more competent and more effective. You know, that was a great pitch for the membership, but we aren't going to have 80% of Corbynism from Keir, and that's fine. But we need to understand that and then adopt a left strategy based on that, which isn't just saying, "Oh my God, I can't believe he isn't doing the thing that we wish he was doing."
No, I mean, I think there's some strong arguments there. I think one way of putting it is that Keir Starmer put himself forward to say, what better way to sell a radical politics than to be someone who's knighted, than to be a sir? And really, you can turn that around and say, if someone wants politics that radical, would they have been knighted in the first place? And I think we're getting to the second part of that now. I want to bring in Dawn now, because we're sort of comparing Starmer, or judging him compared to Jeremy Corbyn. You obviously had a key role in the shadow cabinet when Corbyn was leader, but you can also give us a longer term view of the party. You've been an MP under Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, not Ed Milliband actually, because you were out of Parliament for those 5 years, and then Jeremy Corbyn. Where would you place Keir Starmer on a left-right spectrum between those four leaders?
Well, I think it's quite complicated. I think if you look at the video, as you said, it's quite emotional, and you would plant Keir quite firmly to the left, and it would be sort of full of hope. I think that the strategy, you know, and James has talked about it, if you like, from his experience to how things are presented. I think that Keir's strategy, to me, is basically at the moment to do nothing, to do very little, and to expose that the emperor has no clothes on. And so to reveal Boris and the rest of his merry men for their incompetence. And I think in a way that strategy has obviously to them been working, because we are level pegging in the polls, but it's not going to take as much further, I don't think, now. So it needs the next steps now need to be implemented, and those next steps have to be around policies and directions and where we're going. And it has to be more, it can't just be about our values and what we think. It's going to be.
We've got Dawn. I'm going to interrupt you because we're having a few problems with your audio. So we're actually, I'm going to sort of go ahead to our next clip, and then we're going to come straight back to you, and Fox will have sorted out your audio by then. So we've sort of looked at how left-wing Keir Starmer is. I've got a sort of more, I suppose, surprising question now, one that I didn't realise I'd be asking 6 months after he became leader. How liberal is he? And again, I want to show a clip of the Starmer we knew before he became Labour leader. So this is Labour Party conference in 2018. And this is, I suppose, where Starmer puts himself forward as the tribune of Remain, the tribune of members in the Labour Party who feel, emotionally committed to the European Union. Let's take a look.
If Parliament votes down the Prime Minister's deal, or she can't reach a deal, that is not the end of the debate. And Labour must step up again and shape what happens next. Our preference is clear. We want a general election to sweep away this failed government. And conference. Having swept them away, we want to install a radical Labour government capable of transforming this country. And that's what should happen after 2 years of negotiations ending in failure. But if that's not possible, we must have other options. And conference, that must include campaigning for a public vote. It's right that Parliament has the first say. It's right that Parliament has the first say. But if we need to break the impasse, our options must include campaigning for a public vote, and nobody is ruling out Remain as an option. And conference. And conference.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realise I was going to come back that soon. We're going to go straight to Dawn, see how your sound is doing now. So the question I suppose I want to pose to you is, many people would have had doubts about, is Keir Starmer going to be particularly left-wing? I suppose one of the advantages I thought when he became leader, compared to what came before. So say under Tony Blair, for example, you ended up with a Labour Party that was incredibly authoritarian. And, in terms of the Iraq War, had no respect for international law, or the human rights of people in other countries. I thought with Starmer, at least we got a human rights lawyer. He's probably not going to do Tony Blair style things, and he did really pitch himself to Labour members as a liberal. Now he's going for a kind of social conservative angle, and I want to know sort of what your thoughts are about that. How worried are you that he's going to go in a sort of blue Labour direction, which we might not have expected when he put himself forward to be leader?
I think, can you hear me okay?
You sound amazing now, Dawn.
I think the key is going to be that we need to hold Keir to what he originally kind of promised and portrayed, and I think that's vital and important. I mean, I don't know what his strategy in regards to his direction is, but what I do know is that we had a commitment to stick to the party's manifesto, and we cannot be outflanked by the Tory government. And at the moment, I feel in some policy areas, the Tory government are implementing policies that they are taking straight from our manifesto, and they're almost, if you like, more left than us as a Labour Party, and that will do us no good whatsoever. We will struggle, and we can't just appeal to voters who never voted to us. We've also got to make sure that we keep the voters who are solid to us and our core beliefs as a socialist party, and we shouldn't be scared of that. I mean, I did a conference earlier today where they were saying, we should sever our ties with the trade union, and the Tories said that, and I said, what a stupid, ridiculous thing to say. And we need to start nipping all of this foolishness in the bud now. And Keir needs to be leading on that, and he just needs to be stronger on some issues. But as I was sort of saying earlier before sort of my mic disappeared, I think Keir's strategy at the moment is to essentially do nothing and to just expose the emperor with no clothes on, and to give himself a platform to be able to be heard, maybe in areas that they weren't listening to Labour before, which is cool. I can live with that. But we will need to start talking about our policies and our core strategies and beliefs as a Labour Party.
I want to get up now a quote from a Stephen Bush article, which is, and this is going to be thrown at James in a moment. So this is his explanation of why Starmer is sort of going down the more Brexity, social conservative angle than we might have thought when he was in the shadow cabinet. So Bush writes, for Starmer and his inner circle, a more economically and socially liberal Labour might do better electorally, but it would be at the expense of the party's soul. Winning back seats Labour lost in 2019 and 2017 is not just about achieving power, but about what type of party it is. As one of his close allies put it to me, we're not the Democrats, meaning a loose coalition of social liberals, big city progressives and some trade unions. Labour is a party of the labour interest of working people in the trade union movement. It is the Labour Party's desire to revive that historic identity that distinguishes it both from its recent Corbynite past and its electorally successful New Labour days. It's not just victory Starmer aims for, but to save Labour as we know it. Now, when I read that, I sort of thought of you, James, because I was just imagining you kind of pulling your hair out, actually, because I think this could have been written about many people in the leader's office when Corbyn was leader. And one of the main reasons they sort of travelled away from that kind of positioning was that Starmer was dragging them in a different direction. So I kind of wanted to get your response to what do you see as Starmer strategy being described in these terms now?
Yeah, I mean, that's rubbish. I agree with Dawn that the strategy is a sort of win by default strategy, and that could win electorally. I actually don't think the strategic social conservatism is that weird relative to the hard Remain. If you think what was hard Remain, continuity Remain, it was mainly, or in large part, it was a professional managerial class project. Most of the people that were the leading figures of the People's Vote campaign within the hard Remain, continuity Remain, within the media and so on, that's that sort of class formation. And the reason why I call it strategic social conservatism that he's following is because it's clearly not heartfelt. It's clearly not believed. It's a strategy to manage a group of people who you don't really have very much to offer to. And it's, again, that reads to me as a kind of professional managerial class strategy, rather than the sort of strategy that Stephen Bush was outlining there, which is actually substantially similar to what quite a lot of what the Corbyn strategy was, which is to try to prevent the cleavage within the working class majority in Britain that we are seeing animated by culture wars and by Brexit, but to do so not by strategically moving to the right, and not by saying nothing and allowing the Conservatives to constantly drag the spectrum further and further to the right, but finding other grounds to unite people on a Green New Deal, on a radical economic message, on redistribution, on reducing inequality, on taxing the rich, and so on. And I think I think that that briefing that's been given seems quite dishonest to me.
Patrick, I want to go to you, and I suppose my question now is: there's a number of ways you can interpret this, because people who are very supportive of Keir Starmer, so someone like Paul Mason, who sort of comes on the show, they say, look, he might not look left wing from what he's saying to the public, but I know the guy, he is, and he's just saying what he needs to say to win Labour a majority. And so the idea would be that ultimately, you know, he's not an opportunist. He sort of has these core values, and they are left wing. But what he wants to do is say whatever is necessary to get elected, and then implement something a bit more radical. And you know, from your conversations that you have in Westminster, do you think there's any truth to that, or should we take Keir Starmer at his word when he basically suggests he wants to be, you know, a more competent version of an establishment prime minister who's more competent than the current incumbent? Let's put it like that.
Well, the argument people around Keir Starmer make is essentially the one. Dawn hits the nail on the head when she says it's essentially do nothing, win back a degree of trust among voters who, for whatever reason, have emerged from the past 5 years or longer, not wishing to give the Labour Party a hearing. And then once you have, I don't know what the metric for measuring this is, but once you feel you have won their trust back, then you can start making economic arguments, right? That is why Labour's tax policy is essentially, it's not for us to have a tax policy until 2024, because people around Keir Starmer feel that they don't have the credibility, that Labour's brand is not strong enough to be advancing economic arguments. But sort of what Keir Starmer thinks is sort of secondary to this question, and it comes back to the idea of pressure. You know, you look at recent interventions from, you know, people like Andrew Fisher, and the stuff Dawn and James have been saying. It's all about sort of maintaining pressure on Starmer to maintain the 10 pledges, to advance the economic arguments he said he was going to advance. But that is not going to be the only source of pressure. And you look at the MPs on the front bench, you know, there are 10, maybe now 10 or 9 or 10 campaign group MPs on the front bench, mostly in junior positions. Obviously, you have Momentum, you have the unions that aren't supportive of Keir Starmer. But if you look at sort of the key briefs related to the key pledges of Starmer, you know, human rights-based foreign policy, or, you know, a more dovish foreign policy, the economic radicalism, does anybody really think that a Treasury front bench that includes, that by majority, you know, people like Pat McFadden, Wes Streeting, Bridget Phillipson, a foreign affairs front bench that has, you know, Wayne David and Stephen Doughty, and then you have the Home Office with Holly Lynch and Conor McGinn, you know, all people from a Labour tradition, but it's not the Labour tradition that would make the 10 pledges that Keir Starmer made. And so those, you know, those policy teams really going to be agitating for the 10 pledges, or are we going to be moving to a traditional sort of Labour right territory? Because they were the big winners of the first front bench. And if you look at the remaining MPs who voted for airstrikes on Syria, the 29 that are left, you know, I think a majority of them now have positions on the front bench. So I don't really see, even at the point where it comes to decide, you know, the leadership comes to decide what arguments is going to advance, that the pressure in the PLP is not going to be brought to bear in such a way that it's not going to, even if, you know, it's the 10 pledges by any other name, they're not going to be the, you know, the spirit of those 10 pledges or the letter of those 10 pledges. I don't think it's going to be quite as strong as it was intended to be in January 2020.
Do you think Keir Starmer's a signpost or a weather vane? So, you know, politicians are often divided into, do they just go with the wind? Do they just allow themselves to find themselves in the, you know, the equilibrium between different sorts of pressure, or do they stand by what they believe and try and change political reality?
Well, obviously, I think that the strategic choice that's been made now is to present him as a weather vane, so that then you might direct voters to the signpost that says strong social democratic platform here. But it depends, if you are allowing yourself to spin it in a direction that a critical mass of the PLP and a critical mass of your front bench then how do you put that genie back in the bottle? You have to be very assertive, and maybe his mandate is as such that he can be, but it's a risky.
There's not much evidence that that's the plan.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, basically the problem is much of the PLP agrees sincerely with the stuff he's saying strategically is part of the problem.
Dawn, I want to go to you because it seems like we're going to move into our next phase of the conversation, because it seems like there's actually relative consensus that Keir Starmer isn't particularly left wing. Not that he's an evil Blairite who's trying to regain the party so he can invade a Middle Eastern country, but someone who doesn't have many commitments to the kind of left wing vision that Jeremy Corbyn had and many Corbynite members would, many people who traditionally go to the World Transformed. So we're gonna move on to pressure. How can left wingers pressure Keir Starmer to take different positions? And probably the most obvious place that a leader has problems with people who might oppose their positions is in Parliament, is the PLP, the Parliamentary Labour Party. Dawn, the MPs, you're there, you're one of them, you sit among them. The impression I get from the outside is that Keir Starmer at the moment is completely unassailable. It seems like the MPs predominantly are just incredibly relieved to have a leader who they see as more of one of them. The civil wars of the Corbyn era are over, and Keir Starmer looks quite untouchable. Would you agree with that analysis?
You know what? I think it comes down to sort of discipline. I actually think that sort of those of us, people like say those of us on the left, I actually think that we actually are really quite disciplined and have the party's best interest at heart. When Jeremy was leader, you had, everybody kind of carping in the background, getting in the media, getting mad, attacking him, and kind of destroying the Labour Party from within. And that's not sort of what the majority of us are about. And so I think actually that we've shown complete discipline and should be given credit for that. And how do we make our voices heard? I think is by ensuring that we do media. We can't be afraid of doing media. I mean, there are very few sort of MPs kind of from the shadow cabinet doing media at the moment. And I think, they are being very, very sort of closed. But I think a lot more of us need to sort of do media and talk about Labour's values and where we're going, because we are a broad church, as they like to say. So you cannot exclude one section of the party, because I think it has to boil down to policies. What are our policies? What is our strategy? What do we want the country to look like? We need to be talking about post-COVID now, when we come out of lockdown. What will the country look like? We are facing austerity like we've never seen before, and we are facing a huge threat of no deal Brexit. That is going to have a devastating effect on the majority of the country, even in areas where people voted for Brexit. So we need to start laying down our ground now and saying, look, this is what Labour is about. And, come and talk to us, come and join us. And we can't just wait for that to happen, because the fear is, the strategy is okay at the moment, but if you wait too long, there'll be a tipping point, and then people still won't listen to us. So you've got to get it quite right.
I asked on what your red lines would be. And what I mean by this is, I suppose the PLP have a fair degree of power in that they can go on the television and trash the leader. This happened all the time under Jeremy Corbyn. And you don't strike me as someone who's in a rush to do this. You don't strike me as someone who just wants to attack the leader for the sake of it. But are there any policies or any positions that you can imagine Keir Starmer taking where you would be straight on the phone to BBC or Channel 4 and say, I want to come on your show and say that what Keir Starmer has done is wrong and that he, should watch his back fundamentally?
So, I mean, Michael, like my first priority is to get a Labour government. And I think, Labour government is way better than any Tory government will ever be. And that will always be my first priority. I do think at the moment that Keir and his shadow cabinet, many of them could be much stronger in areas around Black Lives Matter. I think they could be stronger around that. I can think they could be more aggressive in regards to the government's incompetence and their handling of the pandemic. And, we need to remind people that the government is responsible for where we are now because of their lack of action. There is obviously the argument for, showing that the emperor has no clothes, giving them enough rope to hang themselves, as they say. There is, an element of that. But let's go out there and say, well, actually, take the fight to the Tories. I kind of, I miss the fight, if I'm honest with you. I think, we can be taking the fight to it's a wide open goal. I mean, in fact, Boris has been so incompetent. He's not enjoying the job at all. He's complaining that he's losing money every single day. He's not getting enough money. We could be 20 points ahead, really. People used to say the problem was Jeremy. Now we've got somebody that people consider to be prime ministerial, competent. He does, fairly well at PMQs. It's not setting the world alight and exciting, but it's stable. So, let's edge it a bit more. I mean, let's get 20 points ahead. Let's not be just, oh yeah, we're level pegging. The government's seriously incompetent.
We've had enough of strong and stable. You want to go on the attack?
The government just take the fight to the Tories.
I want to go to James and stick on the topic of the PLP because obviously, I suppose you spent a lot of time trying to manage malcontents and within the PLP who were, I suppose, either trying to undermine the leadership for its own sake or trying to drag the policy direction in a particular way. I suppose one legacy of Corbynism is that there are more left-wing MPs than there were before. So the Socialist campaign group used to be, 10, 15 people. There's now 34 people in it, which is sort of the official block of left-wing MPs. And we can talk about opposition, but also if Starmer were to become prime minister, if his appeal or his strategy, which we've all said is reasonably successful to make himself seem prime ministerial to the population, if he gets into that role, you could have these 34 MPs being real linchpins in terms of they could cause defeats. My concern would be, do they seem well organised enough? I mean, I haven't really heard much from those 34 MPs in the campaign group, and how much trouble do you think they would be able to cause for a Prime Minister Starmer who was trying to shift the party to the right?
So I'm not going to answer your question because I think it's the wrong one and it's the wrong focus that we have. I think because we've,
Fine.
I mean, respectfully, but I think that we need to, as a socialist strategy, and thinking of all of the socialist resources that we have, which are quite decent. We need to get our heads out of Westminster. We need to get our heads out of the corridors in Normanshire South, the front bench, Lotto, because I think we're still slightly stuck there and thinking that we're able to negotiate with what has replaced us in a way that we can't really. And
they will be able to if Starmer's in power, right? I mean, if they're in power with 30 left-wing MPs, they will have proper leverage.
I mean, perhaps, but how they would actually have proper leverage is if we change the ground around the party and also around the government. So by that I mean, if there are real campaigns in the country like Black Lives Matter, but also like the tenants movement now against the evictions, those are the things which are going to shift the political weight in this country, shift what is possible, and then change the ground that the leadership stands on, and also strengthen the hand of those 30-odd Socialist campaign group MPs. And I also think not having just the focus on the MPs and Parliament alone means that we're in a better position to have a strategy which is don't carp, build. We've got quite a lot of socialist resources across, some in Parliament, across Momentum in the grassroots and in the trade unions and in the whole galaxy of movements and organizations that are progressive in this country. And I think rather than just try to focus narrowly on Westminster, we should be trying to unite those as much as possible into as formal an alliance that can then campaign and put forward the kinds of arguments that Dawn was saying. What do we want to see in the post-COVID world? How are we responding to climate change? What are we doing about the coming eviction crisis for tenants? And I think that's a far more effective socialist strategy for both changing the party but also changing society, because you're doing both at the same time. And I think that's where our focus should be, rather than in thinking that Keir is basically our guy, maybe, or he's not really our guy, but if we push him a bit this way, he'll do more our thing. I think no, the world is in huge flux. And how it's going to settle down in 2 years' time, nobody knows. We need to be an organised socialist force that is trying to remake that world to have enough socialist possibilities. And I think that is the way that we influence Keir, that's the way we influence a future Labour government, and that's how we influence this government as well, this U-turning government that doesn't have a clue what it's doing either. And I think that is a far more coherent socialist strategy than fixating on whether we should get more of our MPs to criticise the leadership on this issue or that.
I don't think it's about. I think it's about leverage, right? So if Keir Starmer is in government, they are going to have a lot of material power to change policy. Not do we want Ian Lavery to shout at Keir Starmer this day or that day?
Well, I mean, I think the material power is if there is a national tenants movement, for example, that is able to take serious action to insist on a particular policy. Let's say Labour goes into the next election with most of the housing policies from the last manifesto, or even just half of them. In order for those to, Keir's strategy seems to be, if you have better people in government, they will be able to do good things. That is not what has happened in history, basically, ever, because the forces of reaction, the forces of capital, the forces of the establishment shift the government, drag the government to the right. It is only if you have a government which is there and is open to an array of progressive forces, of trade unions, of various social movements that are strong enough to force through the kinds of progressive policies that we want. And so I think our strategy, our social strategy, it has to be strengthening those progressive forces as much as possible, because that is what we will need to get decent policies from any government.
You've gone full circle, James.
Sorry.
3 years in Westminster and now you're all social movements again. Patrick, I want to go to you for an insider take on Keir Starmer's team. What do you think they're scared of? Not from the Conservatives. What are they scared of from the Labour left or from forces to their left within society? Where are they under pressure?
I mean, to be blunt, I think if you asked them that question, the answer would probably be some variation on not very much. And at the risk of going back into Westminster, I think that's because they've calculated that the Labour left is something of a busted flush. They have, in their view, divided and ruled. They've won that big mandate. And they have won the right to ignore whatever argument any bit of the left is making at any one time. That isn't to say they might disagree or agree with those arguments, but they think their internal position is strong enough that for now, at least, pending the results of the Gen Sec elections or the NEC elections, they have sort of free rein to basically ignore a left that either carps or seeks to build. But the interesting thing about what James just said is the sort of thing Keir Starmer was saying in 1986, 1987, when he was writing for, obscure pamphlets. And, he was very much of the sort of Hillary Wainwright view of, you unite the disparate fragments of liberation politics as they were then, not necessarily what James is saying now, and they cohere into a bigger, broader-based movement in the country, and that is what powers a genuinely representative Labour Party and unites the progressive forces in British society. But that isn't necessarily what they're trying to do now. But to answer your actual question, are they scared of anything? I think they're scared of left-wing frontbenchers or left-wing activists from the Labour Party being seen as, Dawn saying, let's get the campaign group on television. Now, the campaign group is better organised than it has been. I'm still quite wet behind the ears, but, it's a sort of, much more public-facing organisation in this parliament. That's a conscious decision that's been made. But, I think if anything scares them, it's being seen to take left-wing positions at this point, or being seen as the party of, say Dan Carden goes on television tomorrow and says, yes, I'm for wealth taxation. That's the thought of a front bencher, even though there's campaign group front benchers on the front bench. I think that scares them. Hence why they're so keen to shut these discussions down. Hence why, you had Annalise Dodds saying we should look at wealth taxation. You had Starmer saying it something, a sort of diet version of that on LBC, and then within a couple of days, the position was we don't talk about tax until 2024. Thanks very much. So if anything scares them about the left, I think it's the Labour left being seen to publicly exist as an integral part of the Labour Party, not necessarily any of the positions they take.
So they're just worried about the Labour left embarrassing them, essentially, because they could always just in that scenario sack Dan Carden as well, right? They've shown they're very willing to sack left-wing frontbenchers if they see them as an embarrassment.
Yeah, but it's the sort of the strategic decision Starmer's campaign made was to embrace the Corbynite left, or at least the bit of it they could live with. As an integral part of the Labour tradition, and presenting Keir as the inheritor to that tradition. Now it's about saying, well, hang on, there's only one legitimate source of policy thinking within the Labour Party now, and it is the Leader of the Opposition's office and the shadow cabinet. And if you, so that is the sort of the pinch point, as it were. He
wouldn't allow the kind of freelancing that he did as Brexit secretary.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. He poached a gamekeeper.
We're going to look at, we've got one last clip for you, and this is an example, I think, of Keir Starmer oversteering. So obviously he took a knee for Black Lives Matter. Then Black Lives Matter came out wanting to defund the police. This made him a little bit terrified that he could get tarred with the defund the police, Black Lives Matter brush. And this was the save he tried to make. Let's take a look at him talking to the BBC earlier in the year.
That's nonsense, and nobody should be saying anything about defunding the police. I mean, and I would have no truck with that. I was Director of Public Prosecutions for 5 years. I worked with police forces across England and Wales, bringing thousands of people to court. So my support for the police is very, very strong and evidenced in the joint actions I've done with the police. There's a broader issue here. The Black Lives Matter movement, or moment, if you like, internationally, is about reflecting something completely different, and it's reflecting on what happened dreadfully in America just a few weeks ago, and showing or acknowledging that as a moment across the world. And it's a shame it's getting tangled up with these organisational issues, with the organisation Black Lives Matter, but I wouldn't have any truck with what the organisation was saying about defunding the police or anything else. That's just nonsense.
So when Keir Starmer said that, there was some pushback initially because he'd, I suppose no one really expected the Labour leader to say they were in favour of defunding the police, but because he called it nonsense, people thought it was overly dismissive. But it was mainly this line, it was a Black Lives Matter moment that pissed people off. And why I think this is interesting, Dawn, is not just that he said that, but this actually seems like one of the situations where he did get a bit uncomfortable. He did end up having to come out and say, oh, actually, I regret saying that. I regret calling it a Black Lives Matter moment. What I meant is it's a defining moment. I think he had to rewrite history because I'm pretty sure he went out there to try and distance himself from the movement. But the pushback scared him. And I wonder what your analysis is of that series of events. Why was it that in that particular situation, Keir Starmer had to roll back on what he'd said? Do you think he is genuinely worried that he could lose, votes and popularity among young voters, ethnic minority voters, etc.? Do you think we can see a glimmer of his responsiveness to people to his left in that particular sequence of events there?
So this is why it's important that we keep him honest, right? Because if we were to lose, for instance, the black vote or the young vote or the progressive vote, then we will lose many seats, more seats than we will gain. So this is why we have to keep the party honest from its core. And, what Patrick said hurt a little bit, ouch. But he may think, or, the shadow cabinet may think that they'll be embarrassed by seeing the left on TV, if you like. But actually, when you think about the policies that from the 2017 and 2019 manifesto, the Conservative Party are taking policies from those manifestos. And I think it's important that we recognize that, because come the next election, we will need to have some policies, but we have to be mindful that, a lot of our policies would have been stolen, which is fine. because they're great policies. They're not done to the whole realm of what we need to be done in society, but we kind of all need to read the room in terms of where we're going politically. So I think it's absolutely vital that we do organise and mobilise, like James was saying as well, because without unlike the Tories, so it could be fine on paper saying we want to present ourselves this way as a political party, but without our activists on the ground, we will not win an election, because we will have nobody to deliver leaflets and knock on doors. We are not the Tory party. We don't have, millionaire funders who have been made richer, can I say, some may say controversially, by the amount of money that they've been getting from procurement contracts from Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson. So they've been made richer, and they will have lots more money to pile in to the next general election. So actually, we cannot abandon our base, and we cannot abandon our heart of the party and the core of the party, because that would be a huge mistake.
We're going to go to some questions in a moment. So start putting your questions in the comments, and I think I'm going to do it in a kind of quick fiery way. We're going to get everyone up on screen to do that. It might be chaotic. That's what I'm hoping. I want to bring in James Schneider before I do that, because I've been talking about your response, which is basically real change happens on the streets in social movements, and then you just pressure a political party, which is basically seen as something separate, to move into that space. Or I suppose to cut the question short, what's the point in people being in the Labour Party in that vision? Because I know there was sort of an idea when Corbyn was leader that you'd have this thing called a movement party, where social movements and the Labour Party would unite into this social force, and you'd have the leader of the Labour Party as almost leading social movements. If you're seeing them as purely external and applying pressure on the Labour Party, from which you shouldn't expect that much, why should people remain members of it?
I'm not suggesting that people should be outside the party at all. I mean, I think that we should, as part of the bringing together of those socialist resources, let's face it, the overwhelming majority of them lie within the Labour Party, and that's a potential source of strength. So when I'm saying bring forces together, I mean quite concrete things like a formal alliance with some kind of coordinating committee between the Socialist Campaign Group MPs, the left-led trade unions, or the lefts of the unions that are not left-led, Momentum, and perhaps some other groups, to provide some coherence and coordination and direction for the left as a whole. And that sort of body would then be much better placed to engage with the parts of the movement which sit half outside, half inside the Labour Party. I mean, obviously, lots of activists in trade unions, in tenants activists, Black Lives Matter activists, climate change activists, XR activists, so on. Quite, a good bulk of activists in all of those movements are in the Labour Party, and that is a source of strength. So I'm not arguing for the kind of thing that Patrick was suggesting that Keir was arguing for in the late 80s, of a kind of airy, if everyone comes together, we'll pressure the politicians, but let's not sully ourselves by getting involved. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying the party is not just what happens along 2 or 3 corridors in Westminster. The party is over 500,000 people in every community in the country, in every workplace in the country, and we should start viewing it more like that. And I think it's from there that we will get our strength.
All right, can we get everyone up on screen while we do some quick fire questions from the audience? Is that possible? Yes, this is what I wanted. Right, first question. I suppose you can sort of move your head a bit if you want to answer it. Does Starmer have a class analysis? Who's going for it? Yep, James, go on.
Not in a way that would be Capital and Labour, and I don't think so. I mean, of course, they look at voter groups, and you can see that in his head of policy, Claire Ainsley's work, and they've got an idea of particular types of working class and the remaking of working class, but it doesn't seem to fit into a kind of a coherent class analysis that would come out of a Marxian tradition. So,
and our next question: did Ed Milliband become leader 10 years too soon? Dawn.
I I think that's probably based on people seeing his performance the other day in Parliament, and they got excited because they're like, yes, that's what an opposition is like. And I think that's kind of based on the fact that, you know, people have been missing that type of opposition. No, I don't. I mean, I wasn't there under his leadership, as you know, so I don't know if he became a leadership too soon. But I think people miss him now because he performed really well at the dispatch box the other day and sucked it to Boris. And really, that's what people like to see.
A follow-up for Patrick, I suppose. Is Ed Miliband now the most left-wing member of the shadow cabinet?
There's certainly an argument for that. I mean, a lot of people are very. There's whispers that Lotto are quite worried about Ed Miliband and his willingness to talk about actual ideas in public. There's some suggestion of a degree of jealousy at the plaudits Ed received earlier in the week. And obviously, if you have Ed is someone with a fully formed idea of how an economy should work, is thinking deeply and often out loud about what the economy should look like after COVID. So there is potential for a little bit of tension there, particularly with someone like Annalise Dodds, who obviously was thought widely and deeply when she was in John McDonnell's Shadow Treasury team, but is now quite solidly holding the Lotto line of not saying very much at all. So watch this space. But I think basically if you're judging, maybe not in terms of what's inside, but in terms of what he's willing to say out loud, certainly.
Lucy asks, what sort of policies can we expect from the Labour Party come the next election? I mean, I suppose the background there is they're not, they've said we're waiting until 2024 to announce our policies. If you've got a crystal ball in front of you, what do you think the platform's going to be? James, go on, you blinked.
I think it would be quite stripped down, probably. Not necessarily because they want to move hugely to the right, although I think there will be various policies that are ditched. But I think so his head of policy, who seems very influential, Claire Ainsley, who, if it's the same as under us, would be in charge of writing the manifesto. Her background is more in comms than in policy. Like Andrew Fisher's was more in policy than in comms. So I imagine it would be more written as a political document rather than the outcome of policy development over several years.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree. But can I just say on that, like, if we don't have anything that inspires people, nobody will vote Labour. So it won't matter what the polling's saying. I think ultimately, we need to get to that point, which we have got a few more years to go. But it does worry me because as shadow cabinet members, we all had enormous input into what was written in our briefs, and I think that's probably not the same at the moment.
But also from a sort of Westminster Village perspective, if I can sully the conversation with this again.
You don't have to apologise every time, Patrick. That's why we got you here.
Thank you. But just sort of bluntly in terms of media management, obviously there are any number of reasons why Keir is getting a better hearing from the mainstream media. But I mean, look, if you just carry on saying nothing, after a while, people get bored. It will just become boring. Already colleagues in the lobby are saying, when is Keir going to say something? You can sort of, maybe the idea is that when he does make an intervention, it carries so much more weight. But much longer, if this carries on for much longer, I think there'll be less of an appetite, as Dawn suggested earlier. You have a very narrow window in which you can be heard. There's only so long Keir can be not Jeremy. And obviously the new leadership slogan is taking that to the nth degree and stringing that out a bit more. But it won't be long before questions start to be asked about, where's the beef? So that's another thing to bear in mind.
Where's the beef in terms of sort of like where's the meat instead of where's the rows?
Yeah, where's the beef in the sort of what Walter Mondale famously said to Gary Hart in the 1984 Democratic campaign.
Holly Peacock has a good question. What would the impact be of proper left political leadership arising outside of the Labour Party? Which I kind of want to furnish with, I think, a different, well, a very similar question, which I think arises from it. Is the one thing that could sort of scare Keir Starmer is a sort of Corbyn-led third party, say they sort of expel someone who's really seen as a shibboleth, and then there is a bit of an exodus. Could there be a party which obviously is not going to win government, but could be a wrecking operation? I'm not suggesting it. I'm just saying that could, is this something that Keir Starmer should fear?
I'm not sure it will suit us in regards to the ultimate goal, which is getting into government. And I think we should kind of ensure that is part of our focus. But it does seem as though, there will need to be some prodding, let's say, at certain times of the current leadership. And, that prodding should be welcomed. I think that was quite good, actually.
Yeah. Welcome prodding. James, you know Corbyn best. What's he going to do next?
Well, he's definitely not going to set up a splitter wrecker operation. I can tell you that for certain. Jeremy he's campaigning already on the issues that he cares about. He's not getting involved in internal party fights and rows, as you can see, but he's very active, especially on international issues and on justice issues, and he will be forever.
Look, I'm going to do the final question on you as an insider perspective. This is, I think, lots of people's fears. In the next 4 years, can you imagine a purge? So either of left-wing members or of left-wing MPs?
Oh, that's a very good question. There are certainly, to be fair, I don't think, obviously the dream of people on, the you might call them the hard right of the Labour Party, if we're going to invert the, classic Westminster lexicon. The dream is that the EHRC report drops on Starmer's desk, or, it's already dropped on his desk. And for some reason, despite it being a sort of, a statutory body, for some reason, the recommendation is expel Jeremy Corbyn and the whole campaign group. I don't think anybody in Keir Starmer's operation wants that, thinks it's a good idea, or, is expecting that, as much as, people on the outer rungs of his supporters might think that's a good idea. It depends how you define purge. Obviously, we'll have to see what the Ford inquiry says ultimately, and what sort of pretense that can be used for. It's there'll be people around Jeremy Corbyn who sound more receptive. Not Jeremy Corbyn, Keir Starmer. Rachel Reeves was reported in the FT today. Sort of tenuous line in there about sort of being open to a purge of Corbyn supporters, whatever that means. But I think, as far as, people, worried MPs in the campaign group might see it, or people around Starmer who think an organised left is an impediment to his leadership, right? That's an analysis I think everybody in the party shares, that a well-organised left is an impediment to any effort by Keir Starmer or the PLP or anybody else to move the party away from the 10 pledges. Their view is, well, if they don't like it, the left will purge themselves, as they were. And that's, I know that's a worry of people on the left, that left-wing members are leaving. I know that silently, or not so silently behind closed doors, some people close to this leadership or who support this leadership might say, brilliant, if you don't like it, leave. I think the view of some people would be, well, it's already happening, so we don't need to wage this war. The withdrawal is, and the retreat is already happening.
Well, Patrick's probably there to provided a more persuasive argument to stay in the Labour Party than James managed, in fact, because the people who really want you to leave are not your friends. James, yours was fine as well. I'm just saying, I think Patrick, that was quite an emotive sort of finish to the conversation. James, Dawn, Patrick, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. Novara Media is going to be back at 8 p.m. for another TWT crossover. This is for a quiz this evening. But finally, I want to say thank you to the World Transform for putting on this virtual conference. It is a shame not to be there in person. I did love the opportunity to meet the Novara Media Tisky Sour audience at our proper live events, proper in real life events at previous conferences, but I think they've kept the spirit alive. And finally, Novara Media, the World Transformed, both organizations that rely on the support of their donors, their subscribers. So please do check out both of those websites. Go to theworldtransformed.org. You can see what else they're putting on during this conference. Great program. And yeah, get your wallets out for both. We'll be back at 8 p.m. Thanks again to all of my guests. Good night. Good luck.